Up next, we have Carlos Martinez. He's an independent researcher and political activist from London, Britain. His first book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, was published in 2019 by LeftWord Books. His main area of research is the construction of socialist societies, past and present. He's a co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China and co-founder of No Cold War. So Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Brandon, and thanks to the IMG for inviting me here today. The focus of my presentation is, why doesn't more of the Western left support the People's Republic of China? Why doesn't more of the Western left engage in a serious way with Chinese socialism? There are lots of things about modern China that seem to be more or less worthy of support from a socialist point of view. Poverty alleviation. Reducing poverty feels like a decidedly leftist objective. If there was no poverty under capitalism, if there were no homeless, no people without sufficient food to eat, without access to education and healthcare, without work or the possibility of earning an income, most people on the left would probably, hopefully, find something better to do with their time than struggling for a new society. So the fact that China has achieved so much in this realm of poverty alleviation should obviously be something that we study and that we celebrate. Okay, not everybody trusts the Chinese government statistics. Not everyone is convinced by the claim that China in 2020 eliminated extreme poverty. Fine. Nevertheless, it's absolutely beyond question that in the period from 1949, when the People's Republic of China was proclaimed, the Chinese people have experienced an unprecedented and extraordinary improvement in their living standards and their level of human development. China was one of the poorest countries in the world. Millions would die every year due to malnutrition, even in non-famine years. The vast majority of the population had no access to education or healthcare. Life expectancy has more than doubled since 1949. China has achieved universal literacy. Everyone has access to education and healthcare. The social and economic position of women has improved beyond recognition. Yes, sure, life expectancy and literacy have improved in much of the world, but in China's case, they've gone from a long way below the global average to a long way above the global average. The United Nations Development Programme describes China as having achieved the most rapid decline in absolute poverty ever witnessed. And yes, there's tremendous inequality in China, and yes, there are billionaires, but actually the economic baseline, the quality of life for the poor is much higher than in other countries of the developing world. The rural poor in China may not have a great deal of disposable income, but they have access to land, they have secure housing, they're not drowning in debt to feudal landlords, their children get educated, they can see a doctor if they need to, they're entitled to a pension, they have water piped into their homes and so on. So they might be considered as poor, but it's a very different category of poverty to that which can be seen elsewhere in Asia and further afield. And there are a number of other areas in which China is making amazing progress. On climate change and biodiversity, China has emerged as a global leader. On the COVID-19 pandemic, China's established the gold standard in terms of going all out to protect human life. The fact that China is able to focus to such a degree on poverty alleviation, on renewable energy, on education, on suppressing the pandemic, on cracking down on corruption, and so on, doesn't reflect some sort of mystical, ethereal quality of Chinese culture. It reflects the fact that the Chinese state prioritizes the needs of ordinary people. And that in itself reflects the fact that the CPC came to power via a revolution that was led by, supported by, sustained by the working class and the peasantry. It was a revolution that created a workers' state. Moreover, a workers' state led by a communist party with Marxism as its guiding ideology. And yet, support for Chinese socialism is a pretty niche position on the Western left. Why is that? To start with, an awful lot of people think that China is a capitalist country or even an imperialist country. China has nearly 700 billionaires. A lot's made of China's billionaires. Of course, China's a huge country. Proportionally speaking, actually measured in terms of billionaires per million population, China stands at 0.27, which is actually below the global average of 0.35. Monaco, by the way, is the world leader with 79 billionaires per million population. The US is also well above the global average with just under 2 per million. So China can hardly be said to be, the home of billionaires. But anyway, yes, you can find McDonald's, KFC, and Starbucks in Chinese cities. There's private capital, There are big businesses, there are wealthy individuals, there's significant inequality. There are rich people and there are poor people, there's exploitation of labor, and there is integration into global value chains operated by huge multinationals. So a lot of people on the Western left look at this situation and say, well, this can't be socialism. And yet these people face an ideological trap that's quite difficult to break out of. The standard of living in China has increased dramatically and continuously since 1949, certainly including in the period from 1978, when China is supposed to have gone capitalist. No capitalist country has achieved what China's achieved in terms of improving the lives of ordinary people, certainly not on anything like the scale or for such a sustained period of time. Under capitalism, wealth always has a counterpart in poverty. The United States is one of the richest countries in the world, but tens of millions of people lack access to healthcare. Hundreds of thousands are homeless. And that's before we even consider the extent to which US wealth relies on poverty, war, and destitution elsewhere in the world, which is very much not the case for China. So if China's capitalist, and Chinese capitalism has delivered such extraordinary improvements to the lives of hundreds of millions of people, does that mean that we need to think again about being anti-capitalists? That's a serious question for anti-China leftists. The Chinese themselves have always been very clear. They use market forces within the overall context of a planned and state-run economy in order to stimulate the development of the productive forces. The Chinese state maintains tight control over the commanding heights of the economy, heavy industry, energy, transport, communications, and foreign trade. China's financial system is dominated by the big four state-owned banks, which are accountable not to private shareholders, but to the government and ultimately the people. This level of intervention and regulation, which is the opposite of the free market fundamentalism and the so-called small government neoliberalism that prevails in the West, means that capital isn't in control, that the economy exists to benefit the people as a whole. The land in China continues to be owned and managed at the village level. So from an economic point of view, when you do a bit more investigation, China's much more socialist and much less capitalist than it might appear at a superficial level. And I often quote the Shanghai investor Eric Lee, who's interviewed on John Pilger's film, The Coming War on China. He makes an essential point about how China works. He says, China's a market economy, but it's not a capitalist country. There's no way a group of billionaires could control the Politburo in the way billionaires control American policymaking. Capital does not have enshrined rights in China. That is to say, in capitalist countries, the interests of capital come first. The capitalist class is the ruling class. In China, that's manifestly not the case. Look at the top priorities of the Chinese government in recent years. Eradicate extreme poverty, clamp down on corruption, shift to renewable energy, protect biodiversity, protect human life in a pandemic, improve living standards. These goals represent the will of ordinary people, not a capitalist elite. Compare that with the major capitalist countries. Where I am in Britain, we faced years of bitter austerity. Life for ordinary working class people is getting worse all the time. Our death rate from COVID is almost 1,000 times higher than China's. Our progress rolling out renewable energy is painfully and pathetically slow. And the fact that China's government represents the class interests of the masses is also reflected in the fact that it's extraordinarily popular. Studies, including by Western academic institutions, routinely show that the CPC-led government has a 90+% approval rating. Meanwhile, the latest polling data indicates that only 20% of respondents feel that the US Congress is doing a good job. But the US is the democracy, apparently. And the other thing to quickly mention about China and socialism is that the Chinese themselves continue to conceive of their own political trajectory in terms of socialism and communism. Xi Jinping often says, only socialism can save China, and socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism and not any other kind of ism. All school students learn the basic tenets of Marxism. All the major universities have schools of Marxism. It's kind of difficult to understand why the Chinese would go to such lengths to pretend to be socialist, to pretend to be Marxist. Another important factor in how the Western left engages with China is the propaganda war. A lot of people who won't even give critical support to Chinese socialism are more than happy to give uncritical support to anti-China propaganda put out by Western imperialists. China's the new colonial force in Africa. China's the new colonial force in Latin America and the Caribbean. China is cornering developing countries in debt traps. China's perpetrating a genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. China's preventing Tibetans and Inner Mongolians from speaking their languages. China's trying to wipe out democracy in Hong Kong. And the list goes on. And each item can be and has been comprehensively debunked. But why do people fall for these lies over and over again? It should be perfectly obvious why the US and its allies would wage a propaganda war against China. China's rise constitutes an existential threat for US hegemony. China is, by most measures, the largest economy in the world. It's a leader in multiple key areas of science and technology. It takes an independent and anti-imperialist stance on the global stage and consistently supports the global south, consistently works towards multipolarity. It's a non-white power. It's run by a communist party. For these reasons and more, China's the principal target in the US-led new Cold War, and the propaganda war is part of that. And yet people still fall for it. Why do people who consider themselves to be critical thinkers not think a bit more critically about the information they're being fed? And there are a few elements to this. For one thing, a lot of this propaganda is quite powerful, pretty sophisticated, and it sort of actively connects to progressive ideas and sentiments. Particularly since the Carter administration, US politicians and media have really mastered the use of human rights as a stick to beat their enemies with. They find a problem, they magnify it, they exaggerate it, they build a sort of slick and all-pervasive campaign around it and make you feel like you're a bad person if you don't join in. The accusation of genocide is particularly potent in those terms. By accusing China of genocide in Xinjiang or accusing Russia of genocide in Bucha, you create an emotional, intellectual environment where to stand with China or to stand with Russia is the equivalent of being a Holocaust denier. So you've massively increased the psychological cost of taking a pro-socialist or an anti-imperialist position. The propaganda is very persuasive, very sophisticated, and we have to understand that and we have to systematically counter it. Then the Western left has a couple of quite deep-rooted problems that it needs to face up to. It's got a Eurocentrism problem, and this was referenced by Maria. The trajectory of Marxism over the course of the 20th century was towards the East and the South. It started as the ideology of the North American and West European industrial working class in their struggle against capital. It shifted east, first to Russia, then China, Vietnam, Korea, then south to Cuba, to Mozambique, to Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, Nicaragua, Grenada, and elsewhere. It became the ideology of the oppressed masses worldwide against imperialism, capitalism, and white supremacy. It's very significant that the final sentence of the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, reads, "Workers of the world unite." The Comintern, at its second Congress in 1920, at the suggestion of a certain Vladimir Lenin, expanded this to "Workers and oppressed peoples of the world unite." But it feels like a lot of the Western left has never quite caught up with that. In their minds, workers' struggle still mainly looks like white men working in factories and demanding pay rises. The idea of a Chinese or Zimbabwean peasant being at the cutting edge of global class struggle doesn't quite resonate. The less a movement looks and acts like the European working class of the late 19th century, the less support it gets. And if you look at the communist parties in countries like China and Korea, countries that really aren't at all Europeanized, that don't have their philosophical roots in Greece and Rome and so on, they don't fit that bill. Connected to that, the Western left also has a dogmatism problem. Let's just admit it, in spite of, or perhaps because of our lack of success building a socialist project of our own, we've developed very fixed ideas about what socialism is. And those ideas often don't match the messy reality of Chinese socialism, which exists in the real world, which is engaged in a long-term battle for its survival in the face of ongoing imperialist hostility and destabilization, and which therefore has had to make compromises and to develop creative solutions to new and complex problems. How do we go about addressing these issues in our movement? It's a tough question. Hopefully we're going to come back to it in the discussion. I think through the work that various groups and individuals have been doing, including this group, including the International Manifesto group, we're starting to see the re-emergence and consolidation of an international anti-imperialist movement. We need to continue developing this work, building unity, deepening our understanding. We need to be cognizant of the propaganda war, and we need to fight resolutely against it. And of course, we need to be alert to the intellectual arrogance and the prejudices that are so easy to absorb when you exist in a culture that's fundamentally racist, fundamentally Eurocentric. Thank you for listening.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.